Thank you very much. It's so lovely to be here again. Last time I was here, I talked about taps and how I have a bit of an obsession with taps and how taps don't work. And this building has the worst taps I've ever seen in my life downstairs. I was there for ages earlier. Again, and I've used it before. So anyway, today I'm going to talk about grids. This is a design talk. It's a graphic design talk. And that all of you in this room, if you're making design decisions, and I'd say all of you are designers, right? Whether or not you call yourself that, that is what you are, that is what you're doing. So I've been doing this a long time, like since I was 1990, I think, when I first started design school. So I get very passionate about grids, I get very excited, I may shout or swear. If that offends anyone, I'm sorry, it just happens. Lisa Reichelt, a friend of mine, she did this brilliant drawing about her mental model for giving a shit. As you see over here, don't care enough, cares too much, and you get more effective till you get to the zone of crazy. I inhabit that zone of crazy quite a lot with this stuff. So I want to also preface this talk by something my lecturers at university told me pretty much like on the first day of design school, which is there are no rules, there are just good decisions. There are equally bad decisions. Some of those we'll talk about today, I'm sure. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Manchester, first of all. So this is Manchester. This is where I grew up, not exactly this street. Manchester's in black and white, for those of you who've never been there. It snows, there's wildlings, there's a wall. I grew up there in the 80s, and in the 80s it was like this. It's grim, right? And there's a reason why good music comes from the north of England, is that everyone's inside, because it looks like this. So what we did is we all took a load of drugs to make ourselves feel better, and along with drug taking, was a lot of quite forward-thinking, revolutionary design that was happening. And within Manchester, that was everywhere you went. It was on posters on walls, it was flyers stuck to columns, like, just bus shelters. It was everywhere. It was part of the DNA of the city. You may know Factory Records, so you certainly probably know the band, New Order. There was a whole bunch of design work that was produced by Factory Records that had a big influence on the city. Now, what's interesting about this is that a lot of this creative work was driven by technology. And technology and design has changed since there was design, right? Things that have happened have driven change. So photo setting, desktop publishing in the 80s, and that became more mature. Now, as these tools matured, then creativity started happening. This is Attic design. You may know some of these. This is David Carson. So he was incredibly influential. Anyone kind of my age who went to design school wanted to be David Carson, right? We wanted to do this. This is what rung our bell. We wanted to be artists, yet we were dealing with type and imagery. Well, we wanted to be artists, but we wanted to make money. Right? So that's why we ended up being designers. David Carson, this is an actual spread of ray gun. And it was an interview with Brian Ferry, and he said it all in dingbats. And it was published. Can you imagine how furious Brian Ferry was? It's absolutely ridiculous. But incredibly exciting and creative. And this could only happen because the tools were mature, right? It couldn't happen when the ground, this couldn't happen really if the ground was shifting underneath your feet repeatedly. You may know this is Wipeout. Anyone remember Wipeout? So yeah, great game. Designers Republic, they did so much on this. Could invented an entire design language that lived around the game. So if we look forward to the web now, sorry, I don't mean to shit on Bootstrap, but we see a similar trajectory, right? We see a similar trajectory over the past 20-odd years or so. Technology matures, it comes to a point, and then creativity kicks in because we don't have to reinvent the wheel all the time. And that's one of the issues that I think that we have with the web now. We're concerned with two things. We're concerned with the machinery we're constantly remaking the machinery of the web. And this is happening faster and faster and faster and faster, right? I think that everyone in this room, what excites them and gets them out of the bed in the morning, because it's exciting learning things new, but equally, it's incredibly frustrating because it's never still for long enough to mature for then creativity to happen, and it's one of the things that I think underpins a lot of creative frustration. The second thing is scale. You know, we're dealing a lot with scale. That's why design systems are the new black. That's why everyone is freaking out about them, is because businesses need to scale and there aren't enough humans. Particularly, there aren't enough designers, everyone in this room. There just aren't enough of us on the planet to do what businesses and services and products need to do, because they exploded, you know, how many years ago it was now, and it's got to a point where we're just really, really struggling. Design has been here before, many, many, many times. I dug this out recently. Look at this. Some crazy monk made this in the 13th century. So the way the manuscripts were made, I think, is just amazing. It was like a factory of monks. And somebody would do something and then pass it along to another monk, and then they do something, and that's where grids started to evolve, because there needed to be an underpinning system so that the monk next to that monk knew what to do. So he couldn't, this monk, I think, had been on the mead or something, because he just went crazy, clearly. So today, I'm going to talk about grids. I'm going to talk specifically about designing grids. So why you should and how you can do it, different types of grids, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about using grids. And those are just like really practical things that you can do tomorrow that will hopefully make your layouts a little bit better. These are the questions that I quite often get when I teach grid design or I talk about grid design. There are lots of questions everybody has, most of which the answer is depends, really. But we'll come on, I'll actually go, if I've got time, I'll answer some of these questions later. So why design a grid in the first place? There are a few very, very good reasons why you should spend the time to learn how to do it and to do it in practice on every project you work on. So firstly, grids provide an order and a connectedness and reinforce hierarchy of your content so your readers like reading it or using it. It aids in usability and comprehension. It is an aid to design. So there are a bunch of predefined rules. It's a shortcut. It answers some questions that you may have in the design, like where should this go? That's quite often the question. You should design a grid to the constraints of your project and your content, which brings us on to 12 columns. Can we just stop this? Please. 12 columns originally was a blog post that Cameron Moll wrote 10 years ago. 2007, I think. No, 2006. More than 10 years ago. And he wrote this because he's like, really, it was screen resolution, desktop screen resolution. We've got all these widths. Let's create an Uber grid so I know that whatever I do is going to fit. 10 years ago. And this is what it looked like. And then people took that and made Blueprint. Anyone remember Blueprint? I think it was the first CSS framework. And then Nathan Smith worked on 960 grid system. Now this just stuck. Because it was easy, right? It was very, very simple. It was approachable. Clients understood it. Designers had something to work with. They knew it would fit within these screens. It was an easy sell to clients. And we haven't really moved on an awful lot since then, 10 years ago. Now, 12 columns was a result of this best fit process, right? It was derived from a page, which we know has problems with responsive design, or did. I think that changes with CSS Grid. And it inverts the key concept that grids are defined from the content, and the content informs the layout. That's the way generally grids have been designed forever. Now, when I've been digging recently into CSS Grid, I mentioned that you know, if we use it to make 12-column grids, it's like owning a Ferrari and driving everywhere at 10 miles an hour. Because this is such a powerful tool. And I'm hoping that it's one of those points of stability that will springboard creativity. Because from what I've seen and from what the brief amount of time I've been using it, is that it works very well, and all of a sudden we can do stuff that we didn't do before, which is new and exciting, but not only that, there's so much thought gone into this, and it aligns very well with the principles that I'm going to talk about today. So, let's dig into designing grids. The whole point of a grid is to connect space. So that means that a bit of type over here is connected to something over here by an underpinning system that the reader can feel but not necessarily be aware of. Now, there's a few people who have said some very interesting things about grids. So Jan Schichold, anybody know Jan Schichold? So Jan was a batshit crazy typographer who wrote this brilliant but kind of scary manifesto called the Neue Typography, the new typography, in the 20s. And his point was that, so at that time, particularly in Germany, there was a lot of creativity in book design, right? There was a lot of flamboyant black letter script and no standardization. So he's a total standardization nut. So this was his point, is that we've had these rules for centuries, we should be using them, why are you doing this crazy stuff? That was basically it. Now what he was talking about here are these things. I don't quite often like showing designs with circles and squares and logos and post-rationalization bullshit on them, because things like, we've seen the Twitter logo with the thing, it's nonsense. This isn't nonsense. This is actually, this is the Van der Graaf canon. So it's a canon of page construction. The idea here is to create the perfect text block. So the perfect positioning of the text block. There's another one, which is the golden canon. There are a few of these, if you Google them, circles and squares. The idea being that it derives a place to put the text that is in proportion with the object that you're holding, the book, so that there is harmony. That's the idea. Robert Bringhurst has a great quote for this, that tangible proportion which, together with the text block, produce an antiphonal geometry. Isn't that lovely? Which has the capability to bind the reader to the book. I think this is a very noble goal for us to try to achieve for designing websites that people are consuming on multiple devices. If we can bind in the same way that we bind content to a book, this is a physical object in our hands. We have a different emotional connection to our phone than we do to a laptop. And it's because it's there and we fiddle around with it, right? This is a noble goal, I think, is to bind the reader to the book. So when I talk about connectedness, what do I mean? Well, I think it's in two ways. It's content out, and then it's canvas in. So content out, you can define a layout by your content. And you start with a constraint. So a constraint, I'll talk about what those may be. Then there's a bunch of things. They could be, a good one up until fairly recently is an ad unit, right? These ad units that were produced by a whole different... It's like in the 1990s they decided to fork the web industry. I know, the ad industry is going to march off this way, and the rest of us are going to go this way. And we've always had this problem, particularly with responsive design. It's getting better now, but there's still a lot of legacy ad inventory around. It's still a thing. And so you can start with a fixed size, an ad unit, and then you derive your grid from the ad unit. So you divide it into two, that becomes your grid unit, and you expand it out over a given canvas size. At this point, I'm not too worried about what that canvas size is. My point is that if I place some content over here, and I have a column here, I know that they're going to relate back to this constraint I have that I have no control over. So it creates a connectedness. So I can do this. I can define my grid, and when it changes, there's still that connectedness there. The other one is canvas in. So that's like a lot of the page cannons that I showed you, right? They start from a predefined, knowable size. And it's something that until responsive design happened, we were all, other than people like Jeremy Keith, we were all in denial about that the fact that the web was fluid and chaotic, and we couldn't control it by saying it's going to be 960 pixels and that's that. Now, certainly with devices anyway, we have knowable sizes. I'm thinking of native apps and things like that. We know how big things are, so we can actually derive layout from that constraint. So we can go inward. So you start with a viewport, and you divide it horizontally and vertically. In space, you can draw some meaningless lines on it if you like. So there are lots of different types of grids, right? I'm just going to scoot through a few of them. And a lot of people who I talk to when I teach this in workshops and things get very hooked up on what I can and can't do. Going back to that quote from my lecturer right at the start, you can do anything you like, but you'll know when it looks terrible. And at which point you need to go back and iterate and revise on your grid, which is not what a lot of people think that happens is you design your grid once and then you're done. Well, no, you're not. That should be an element of your design that you can go back, you can iterate again and again upon until it is right for your content. So you can have uneven columns. These were a bunch of examples we produced for GridSet to illustrate that you can do different stuff. This is a 5-column grid that has uneven columns on the side. Now, why? Well, because here's the main columns. We designed the center columns first, and we divided that in 3. Down the layout, it's split into 3 things. 3 different columns, and there's content in there. But we wanted these extra bits on the side, right? These could be captions, image captions, or they could be, asides, stuff that just lives off. Now, if you were to base that upon one of these smaller columns here, here in the middle, the line length would be too short for the type size, right? Simply, it's a practical consideration. People need to read this content, so you shouldn't be a slave to the grid. You should change the grid to suit your content. So that's basically it, right? It's not rocket science. So that's our resultant grid, and it's a center-based design. You can have grids with no gutters. So a gutter in grid layout is called grid gap. A gutter is the space in between columns. Now, quite famously, this is the Marber grid. So you've probably you've all seen these Penguin books. So Marber designed this grid for the display of book covers, right? It's slightly different for content. But what we can do, and what we did as an experiment, was to take this and apply content to it. So this was the grid. Now, it's based upon the golden ratio. I'm a bit like about the golden ratio. I think, but partly because I think the maths is too hard and it's really contrived, right? The golden ratio is just, don't bother. That's why the rule of thirds exists in photography and other compositional theory, right? It's because the golden section is just too difficult practically. So anyway, you'll see here that there are no gutters, yet the columns are defined by the yellow lines, and content can expand and live on its own within them. Now, obviously, you can't have content next to content because there's no gutter in the middle, but that's okay. You just don't use it that way. And a really interesting one, and I'd be interested to know, I'm going to talk to Rachel about this, about whether or not this is possible in CSS Grid, is a compound grid. So a compound grid, this is based upon Carl Gerstner. So he was a designer in the 60s. He's a fabulous mind as a designer. It's more like reading an engineer, reading his books. Absolutely brilliant. In the 60s, he was the designer of Capital magazine. And you can just see down here the grid. That's what the grid looks like for the magazine. It's like ridiculous. But basically what it is a compound grid. Compound means 2 grids in the same space overlaid. And you can use one or the other or a combination of the 2. So this is a 6-column grid and a 4-column grid in the same space. So you can either use 6 columns or 4 columns, but when you combine them, interesting things start to happen, which is this. You end up with this interesting, larger gutter that you can use. And you can compound all different types of different configurations of columnar grid. So this could be a content area, and this could be an aside or a navigation or whatnot. Interestingly, it's I've used these a lot for navigation, sites where they have navigation on the left, because if you use a standard columnar grid, the gutters tend to be too short, right? You often see the navigation bleed too close to the content. It starts to become a bit difficult. So quite often I use a grid like this. Axial grids, these have been around. Like you will have seen these. They were very fashionable in like Russian deconstructivism and modernism, particularly Swiss modernism in graphic design. A poster, and then the content would be sideways for no apparent reason. I think they work really well for posters. I wouldn't bother on the web. It's a waste of time. Baseline grids, again, baseline grids. So a baseline grid is where type is aligned to the baseline of the font, right? On the web, historically, this has been difficult to do up until recently because we use line height instead, right? And that's where this idea of designing to a vertical rhythm came about, but it's so fragile and a pain in the arse to do that I would normally just say forget it. But there's another very good reason why you shouldn't really bother with this, is that baseline grids came about because of multi-column grids across magazine spreads, so a large area, broadsheet newspapers, and they were designed so that there was a sense of harmony from what was over here to what was over here. And everything lined up and everything was harmonious across columns. Now, I think the need for very large multiple column design in design grids for the web, I think is pretty diminished compared to broadsheet newspapers, right? It's also a pain in the arse to do. Modular grids. So I'm telling you these because they're all just different names of stuff that's been around for like 300 years or something. So a modular grid is, again, it's a module, and they're repeated, and that is it. So to design a grid, this is the process, and it's just a 3-step process. Actually, it's 4 steps. But you define a constraint, then you create a unit based upon that constraint, and then you create the grid based upon that unit. That means that there is connectedness to the constraint and connectedness between content. It means that decisions about space, about white space and things like that, are not arbitrary. There is a system underpinning it that space and the space between things is connected to the things, right? It's like music, right? Anyone a musician here? You know that the space in between the notes is as important as the notes, right? It's exactly the same in graphic design. And the last thing is try it, test it, iterate it. Your grid's not set in stone. You should be doing that. Lastly, here's some examples. I tried to think of some examples, and if anyone's got any more, I'd love to hear them, about what those constraints may be. These are ones that I've used in the past. So legacy images and assets is always one where an organization has a bazillion images that they don't want to resize, or there are issues with resolution in flexible display, and so they're like, no, it needs to be fixed. Advertising units, up until recently, the IAB is, it's starting to come through now, responsive ad units at a much broader scale, but there's still an awful lot of fixed size inventory out there. User traffic to a particular device, so if 95% of people are coming to your website or application through an iPhone specifically, then design for the iPhone, right? Viewport size, again. If there are skews towards it, that can help you make some decisions about what grid you have. And if none exist, then you have to make one. And you can make one from images or from type size. So that's basically it. It's not difficult. So I'm going to just go through some really quick examples of using grids, because just because you've built a great foundation doesn't mean you're going to build a Taj Mahal, right? You could equally build like a rundown shed. So using grids is as important, really. So these are just a bunch of little techniques, little things that I've found useful over the years. Firstly, I want to talk a little bit about this. Is Bradley Wiggins. The 2012 Olympics, right? They swept up the golds, the British cycling team, and they did this through the manager, the coach of the team, Sir Dave Brailsford, had this technique that he borrowed from management, really, called the aggregation of marginal gains. So what they set out in the sky cycling and particularly in the 2012 Olympics, but particularly for sky cycling, so Dave Brailsford said, right, in 5 years, we are going to win the Tour de France, and we are going to do it clean. We're not going to take any drugs. Although recent events might actually undermine that. But anyway, for the sake of this, just forget I said that. In professional cycling, that difference between being doped up to your eyeballs and riding clean is about 19%, which is an incredible margin in professional sport. And like that, those kind of margins don't really exist in professional sport between taking drugs and not. So what he did was he took the whole expanse of an athlete's life from what pillow they slept on to what they had for breakfast in the morning to how much they slept to what the medication they were taking, like asthma inhalers and all of that kind of stuff. And they took all of that and he said, right, if we can make tiny, tiny improvements, 0.1% here, and they measured everything, 0.1%, 0.6%, 0.36%, whatever, across this huge range of parameters in an athlete's life, then that will aggregate to 19% and they can bridge the gap. I love this as a philosophy because I think it applies so much to design. It's not often, I mean, we've seen, I've gone through it a little bit, we get these monumental jumps, right? These monumental leaps in technology that allow design to free itself a little bit of the shackles of the past and fly off creatively. That rarely happens, right? It's happened like twice in my lifetime so far. And I honestly believe on the back of responsive design and now with grid layout, we're in one. I think it's incredibly exciting. But I think to realize that shedding of these shackles and moving towards something very, very creative and away from 12 columns, please. To do that, we need to not think big, but think little. Little, tiny, tiny changes across the board. So, I want to talk a little bit about what M's. I went down an M rabbit hole yesterday. It wasn't pretty. Because I've been saying this for ages, right? Talking about constraints, right? No constraints exist, so derive your layout from your type and create your grid using M's. There's a very good reason to do this. It means that the words on the screen are related to the broader layout. There is a connection there. It's not arbitrary. But I am also aware that this is my designer control head leaking out into the chaotic world of the web. So I dug in a little bit, like these are the reasons why. It's control, line length mostly, but connections between the layout. So I suspected this might not be a good thing for a little while, and I actually dug into why. And I discovered one interesting thing, which I'll come to in a minute. So if we take just as a brief overview, an M is the height of the M box within a font. And the M box is split up into 1,000 units. These are arbitrary units that the font uses. But critically, the M width-wise is variable, right, per character. So it looks like that. So 1M is the height of a variable M square, which equals the font size. And that stays pretty consistent, right? However, the size of the proportion of the characters within this square differ greatly. And what started off as a rabbit hole into layout turned into a rabbit hole into font fallbacks, which have an impact on layout if you're specifying any kind of measurement in ems. So we have, going back to the arg, you can derive a grid from an M, right? I've turned the M on its side because it's consistent. That's one M, that way isn't. And I make some columns. Here's my nice grid. But the problem is that the M square, of course, is consistent, and it also is used to define a bunch of other metrics within the font, right? So but these can vary per font. There's an ascender, there's a descender, baseline, X height, cap. Thankfully, browsers are actually getting way better than they ever used to be of having access to this information. So typesetting is getting, even just in the last year or so, a couple of years, it's becoming much more exciting to get the level of control than perhaps we had in the past, which is what I mean about stability. Things are getting more stable, which is great. Now, the problem that I came across with this is that type within this box differs massively. So, and you've probably already come across this. So we have the M box here. It's the same M height, and it's the same font size, yet optically, the type feels smaller. Not only that, but going back to the ascender and descender values, they are declared in the font as well for things like the lowercase g or a big F that goes all the way up, or a big swashy italic ampersand could be massive. Those top and bottom values, which are larger than the M box, define the calculated height of the font. And they also define line height. So what you can have when the font falls back is you can have wildly different layout, which is a big concern. So interestingly, I found out that that's called large on the body and that's called small on the body. Didn't know that. So anyway, so what? Well, the point is just be really careful when you're choosing the stack of fonts, especially if you're relating fonts to layout using Ms, because of the calculated height and the difference in ascender and descender height on the M box. Another really useful technique is hanging elements. So again, we see this in typography all the time. So if you look at this, you see that the E and the S and the T, they all drop below the baseline. So the baseline is this dotted line, and it sits on the bottom of the N and the M. The bowl of those characters sits below it, and that's so that optically it reads well. This is evident in a minute, I'll show you. So faces in circles. We love a good face in a circle, don't we, on the web? So I found the best face I could. And so there's our face on our grid, and it's aligned to our grid there. And I want some content. So I have some content. And you'll see that you have a couple of quotations, and the quote marks are, again, they're aligned to the grid. The problem here is that when you take those away, his very lovely face looks like it's falling into the page, right? It looks like it's falling into the page. Plus, we have these really ugly indentations here and here, particularly if they're starting a paragraph, which quotes tend to do. It causes the eye to jump. When you are defining a layout to begin with, it's really important for the reader that you define a starting point that matches the thing next to it, so that they can optically go, okay, this is the edge that my eye is supposed to follow. So what typesetting and typographers have done for years is that, so if we put the grid back in, we just scoot that over a little bit. There's no magic number here, because that differs depending upon the size of the face, size of the circle. It's just optically. Do it till it feels right. That's what Massimo Vignelli said about typesetting. just move things around till they feel right. And we can also do that with the quotation marks, right? These are called hanging punctuation. It wasn't until InDesign launched that desktop publishing could do this. So this has existed, hanging punctuation has existed like forever in traditional typesetting. Letterpress and typographers, compositors as they were called, used to do this every day of the week. Then Quark Express was launched in the 80s, and you couldn't do this. You could only do that because content lived within a box. It could not go outside the box. Then along came InDesign and could do that, and the world went crazy. It also went crazy because it was a quarter of the price. So then we take away the grid lines. Now, to me, that feels much more comfortable because it's slightly offset. We have a defined line that follows the grid here and here, and we just offset the punctuation. Now, very contentious hanging punctuation is this. So we have a bulleted list, and interestingly, browser default behavior hangs that, right? Does it still do that? I don't know. It used to. Before you apply any style to it, it hangs it off the side of the container that it's in. So, which is actually, I said there were no rules, but typesetters like to make rules. And this was one of them, which is in running copy, so paragraph, list, paragraph, no big spaces between them, not different sections, then hang the punctuation. So hang it off to one side. Now, I know this is a real Marmite thing. People either hate this or they love it, and there's nobody really in between going, yeah, it's okay. Everyone's just like, rah, throw things at me. I'm surprised nobody's done that yet. So hanging elements off the grid, particularly if they're round or punctuation. So padding versus gutters. I mentioned earlier that you can create grids without gutters. But then you have to, how do you deal with space? So there's a great example years ago, Crate and Barrel's website. It's since changed. But this is like the epitome of a designer controlling every single element and pixel perfection to ridiculous levels, and then building a website for it. I feel so sorry for the team who had to build this, because it's like a brochure. It's ridiculous. But what's interesting here is that you can see, well, you actually can't see. In between these elements here are very faint lines, right? Everything butts up. You see the imagery butts up to this line here, this here. This is actually within a square that goes off here, and there's a gray line there. So you might, and this runs across the whole site. So you might think that, okay, well, the grid looks like that. It sits on top, and there's 1 pixel gutter that is actually filled with a line. Well, actually, no, that's not the grid. The grid is actually that. And what happens is all photography color expands either side to then create these columns. Incidentally, these lines are really common in places like newspapers and things like that. And the reason they exist, the very reason they exist, is because of reading flow on a big broadsheet. So quite often, going back years, quite often you look at particularly American newspapers, the New York Times from like early in the century, multiple articles, all higgledy-piggledy along the spread, right? These, and with very, very narrow column width, super narrow. Like often they're like 9-column grids. So these lines we use to clearly demarcate. This thing is not related to this thing. Read down, go back to the top, read again. Or use them as waymarking to help your eye go over here from over here. They were very clear, and they're very, very strong on older newspapers. There aren't that many newspapers that have them now. There are a few. I think the Daily Mail still has them. I tried just reverse engineering this grid a little bit, and what was weird is that these are all different sizes, and I don't know why. So maybe that was the designer made a mistake, and it just got carried through to the final production. So that becomes the grid there. So there are, on the first look at it, there were no gutters, but actually there are. When I was in Paris years ago, I was with my family. My dad's an architect, and Any architect siblings? I know Jen is. Any architect's sons, daughters? No, it's a horrible affliction. Because from a very early age, you're exposed to looking at stuff in a different way. We were walking around the Louvre, and my dad's like, look at this. And he was very upset there was no guttering on the Louvre. But what he did say on that little trip out while he's getting angry at the building because there were no gutters, where's the rain go? He said that, look, there are 9 columns there. And he's like, look, over here, he's like, there's 7 things there, or 5 things. He said that, particularly in architecture, that odd numbers prevail. And the reason is that they look better. It's an aesthetic thing. It's just they look better. If you go to a restaurant and you have, asparagus and egg on avocado on toast, because that's what everyone eats, right, these days, probably there will be 3 spears of asparagus. There probably won't be 4 or 6. And that's because the chef knows that 3 looks better. And that's just it, really. When designing grids, odd numbers tend to look better than even numbers. We see this particularly in newspapers. Go and pick a newspaper up today. Chances are it'll be a 5, 7, or 9 column grid. Don't know why. It's just one of those things. It's one of those things that's just kind of everywhere in design. Hanging lines. So hanging lines, again, these have been very useful when we don't know how long our content is. So they've been very useful on the web. A hanging line in print is just this across the grid, and you hang varying lengths of content from it. Again, on the web, it's been very useful because we don't know what our content is, so what we tend to have done is this, right? Maybe these are a bunch of divs and content in them, and they float, and then we have a pause and another one. This is great for the reader because it says you're finished with this thing, and this thing is a different thing. So use hanging lines, even with CSS Grid. They're very useful design tools to show grouping of content, but also to give your readers a break. Dead columns. So I mentioned even and odd, and so what do you do if you've got a 6-column grid and you want to make it 5? Well, you just don't use a column. It just doesn't become a place where you put things. So this is a 6-column grid with my content in, and okay, I'm just going to remove the content from there. You see this a lot in Swiss modernism. They did this an awful lot, is they'd have an even grid, and they'd kill the content in one column. Similarly, a centered grid, dead columns on the side that content can expand into. So the majority of the time, you don't actually use them. So going back to my questions, I'll just quickly, I've got 2 minutes. I can go through these really quickly. Why should I design a grid? It will only end up there. So you should design a grid because the content is your content, right? Your design problems are your design problems. A 12-column grid was a result of something that was done 10 years ago. Please change it. Don't do it anymore. How many columns should you have? Well, as many as you like. Again, it's defined by your content, right? A gutter is the space in between columns. It's called grid gap in CSS Grid. Traditionally, gutters can be occupied by lines, like I said. You can do, if you're going to do something like that in CSS, a little trick is make sure your gutters are 21 pixels or 31 pixels or whatever, because you have equal space on either side, and then of course, the line occupies 1 pixel. So make sure you account for it. They can be as wide as you like. But wider than you might think. So I always think, oh yeah, 30 pixels, yeah, but then I'm like, no, you've got to add 10%. And they always tend to be bigger than you need. Can columns be unequal in width? Yes. Simply. Do I need gutters? No, not always. What about different viewports? Well, different viewports might require a different type of grid, like a modular grid for a tablet that has a knowable space. Say you're not in a web browser at all. You're delivering this through, I don't know, a Chromeless browser, but an app, I don't know. But if you know the size of the screen, it might dictate a different type of grid that you design. Yes, small screens should have different columns because it's just a smaller area. Golden section, meh, don't worry about it because it's a pain in the arse, frankly, and it's contrived, so steer away. Well, a grid is a guide, not a guarantee. Just because you have a really good grid that you spent ages thinking about it, it's a real big leg up. It'll help. But it's not a guarantee for a wonderful beautiful, usable design. It's part of the process. What's the difference between a module and a unit? None. They're the same thing. They're the smallest repeatable element of a grid, derived from a constraint. Why should you use a baseline grid? You shouldn't. Put simply, it's too fragile. It was never designed. It's designed for many multiple columns. It's designed for creating quick visual, holistic kind of comfort with the design. You realize that something belongs to something over here. We don't have that much space. Do my users care about grids and the resultant layout? No, probably not. But they do care about the content. They care about reading the content. They like to feel something when they read content sometimes. They like to not feel angry about why they can't read something very well. And how do I push back on designers to experiment with more grids? Well, just try it. See what happens. I often find this actually pairing works really, really well. I don't know how many are just pairing engineering and design. Is to, front-end engineering, particularly any kind of engineering actually, and developers tend to be more open to this than designers, simply just because of the way that design happens sometimes. But I'd push people into pairing. It's a really useful way to start experimentation, or at least start that conversation. So I'm going to leave you with Bruce Lee. So, Bruce broke his back. I don't know if you know this. He broke his back, and he was in bed for 6 months. And while he was in bed for 6 months, he wrote a book. And he was a philosophy major as well as a martial artist and a film star. And he wrote this book called The Tao of Jeet Kune Do. And what that was I won't go into too much detail about it because it's really not relevant. It was a manifesto, basically. It was his beliefs on martial arts. But he's got a wonderful quote in there, which was, use only that which works and take it from any place you can possibly find it. Meaning, be open to anything and everything that just makes your work better. Thank you very much. I'll put that down.
Thank you very much. This was an excellent history lesson in grids, showing some of the incredible stuff that we can do, but that we mostly don't do, nope. I think. Then there are, these are, many of the examples you showed were based on, well, more magazine layouts. Print.
Yep.
Yep. So now that we have, one thing that I noticed was since we have viewport relative units, something changed on the web.
Yeah, it did. Yeah, and that was the thing. It was going from, well, the trajectory was, we think we know. It's like that Donald Rumsfeld quote, right? The known knowns and the known unknowns and the unknown knowns that we don't know. I don't know. Jeremy knows it, probably off by heart. We thought we knew the size of the viewport, right? We made that up. Yeah. And then with responsive design, we're like, haha, no, we don't know. Now we're going back to, well, we know, kind of, right? So that's what's so interesting. I think that together with the viewport units and CSS grid, it's that point of hopefully stability and powerful tools to let us make this creative work. The only reason why I showed print a lot was that that's where our history is in design, graphic design, and there's a big untapped well, so.
Okay, so one thing that I noticed is that now that we have viewport units, we can actually recreate these grids.
Yeah.
But we can also use viewport units on typography.
Yeah.
And that makes...
Yeah, well, it just gives us that, I don't know about harp on about control, because I've been harping on for years now about being comfortable with not having control. So it feels great to finally get some back. Yeah, because particularly in typesetting, it requires control to do it properly, to do it right, to do the content justice and for the benefit of the reader. Okay. So.
So there was actually, this was a question So you talked about designing the grid for your purpose, right?
Yeah.
Look for a purpose, look for the constraint,
Yeah.
and then design the grid according to it. But are there cases where you would say, no, I'll just use a grid that exists?
Yeah, 12 columns, that's a good
Yeah,
idea. Yes, there are. There are some very pragmatic choices to make. So if you have like 2 days to bang out a prototype, probably best not spent designing a grid, right? If you, by all means, use Bootstrap. That's maybe, or something else. But the point is, yeah, there's pragmatic decisions to make. If you're embarking on a 2-year design system project, then yeah, spend the time. Do yourself a favor. Yeah.
And as developers, start experimenting and show it to designers to know what's possible?
Oh yeah, well that's what I mentioned, pairing. I think that's probably one of the most beneficial things that I've done in my career, either working in-house or running a design studio, is physically putting designers and front-end development together if the designer isn't doing the front-end development. It's just actually and by osmosis, things start to happen, and experimentation becomes a lot more comfortable. When you've got one discipline within a very siloed organization saying, hey, why don't you do the layout like this? It's going to piss people off. So it's just, softly, gently. Sitting people next to each other is a good idea.
Okay. Thank you very much.
No, thank you, everybody.